I don't have much to say for an intro, so hello, welcome back, and let's talk about movies. The first thing I saw this past week was Venom, Let There Be Carnage. I guess I should get it out of the way right now that I'm by no means a superhero movie fan. I find the Marvel movies to be uniformly watchable and well put together, but in recent years it's become increasingly clear that the studio no longer views it as a creative endeavor, but a monumentally lucrative one. And I personally have no interest in watching past the one that literally has the word end in the title. I find the DC movies more interesting, but it's more because I just find it very entertaining to watch Warner Brothers scramble to have the same success that Marvel did in about half the movies, and I truly believe that Suicide Squad and Batman vs. Superman are some of the worst movies ever made in the history of cinema. But I'll take a total train wreck over a predictably average movie any day. Speaking of which, 2018's Venom was the kind of train wreck that I absolutely had a blast watching. Its total lack of self-awareness led to many hilarious sequences in the film that were very unclear whether it was supposed to be funny or whether it was so awkward and bad that it was funny. Because of that, I can honestly say that I don't think there's ever been a superhero movie I've been more excited for than Venom, Let There Be Carnage. Not because I thought it would be in any way a great movie, but because I at least hoped it would be a great time like the first one. And a great time it was. It's very, very important to note that if you take your comic book movies seriously in any way, or if Venom is like your favorite comic book character, then you're probably not gonna like this movie. And honestly, the movie kinda knows that, and it's all the better for it. I'm pretty sure they knew that they had alienated anyone who actually cares about this character with the disaster that was the 2018 film, so this movie in many ways feels like it was made for people like me who came in from the outside, had a blast making fun of it, and just wanted to see more ridiculous, awkward scenarios with these two characters. This movie is a colossal mess on every level. It feels slapped together, but it also feels like it was trying to just be entertaining and nothing more, and in that way I think I like it more than the first. I was sold on this movie within seconds of it starting. Before the title had even come up on the screen, I made quite a few notes about how incompetently it was put together. One of the villains in this movie has a sound-based superpower, so at the beginning of the film she's basically imprisoned in a soundproof glass box. And the film makes a valiant but hilariously unsuccessful attempt at an interesting artistic choice here. Essentially, when the camera is inside the box with the character, you can't hear anything from outside, and then when the camera is outside of the box, you can't hear any noise that she makes, except in one shot where she's reading a newspaper and the camera is very clearly placed outside the box, but we can still hear the newspaper crinkling. And in this same exact scene, there's another audio gaffe in which a character's talking to her through a microphone, and you can see the actor in the background, and the words that they are mouthing are not even close to what is coming through the microphone. I know this is the kind of thing that's not going to bother most people, and most people probably won't even pick up on it, but I found it glaringly obvious and very, very funny. Another issue with the audio is that Venom is completely incomprehensible at times. He had very many lines that I just could not make out what he was trying to say, and I honestly wish the movie had just included subtitles for those scenes. In the final battle, there's meant to be a very triumphant moment where Eddie starts saying a sentence and then they both say the last word together, but the audio was so poorly mixed that I could not hear what the last word was, and I still couldn't tell you, and that was really, really entertaining to me. The score is completely at odds with the tone of the rest of the film. It seems like it's not trying to take itself too seriously, but the score is very, very serious. There are lines and events in the film that would have been cliched even in a 90s romantic comedy, so it would be hard for me to believe that the intention of the script was anything other than parody at these moments. But the score during these scenes is always very serious. The result is something that feels completely devoid of self-awareness, and that makes it even more entertaining to poke fun at. But it wouldn't be fair for me to sit here and pretend like all of the fun I had was at the film's expense. There were quite a few moments where I was laughing with it, and it really gets the dynamic between its two main characters, even if it's not an interpretation that comic book fans want. And that's why I say this movie was made for people like me. I have absolutely zero prior investment in these characters, so it's really fun to see this bizarre gay rom-com dynamic they have going on. There's a scene where Venom actually goes to a rave, and it was the best thing I've ever experienced. It's at its worst when it's trying to be an actual superhero movie and not just this joke. The narrative is completely unfocused and it feels like it's been edited down to an inch of its life. The villain's motivations are completely surface level and not very well explored. I'm always down for some Woody Harrelson and he's a lot of fun to watch, but I don't know if I could call his performance good. It's very, very over the top, but it was at least entertaining. Tom Hardy gives the same performance he did in the first one. Michelle Williams is completely wasted and doesn't have to be there, and the same can be said for Reed Scott. Venom actually makes a joke at the end about how they didn't even really need him. It's one of those movies where it's very hard to rate objectively because I had a great time watching it, but do I think it's a good movie? No, not at all. I think it's very, very bad. But with that said, I think it's actually an improvement on the first one, which felt very soulless. This at least feels like a movie that wants you to have a lot of fun rather than just trying to be a better movie than it is. I'm gonna give Venom Let There Be Carnage 1.5 stars out of 5, but please do note that the entertainment value is a lot higher than that rating might suggest. VHS 94. If you're not familiar with the VHS movies, this is a series of anthology horror films. Essentially, each one is comprised of a few short films from different directors that are presented as weird, creepy VHS tapes. I never saw the third one, and judging from the reception, I don't feel the need to, but I have seen the first two. And honestly, my thoughts on pretty much every horror anthology movie are the same. By nature, some of the short films are gonna be better than others, and usually there's at least one or two that I find interesting, or sometimes even great. I don't really think the first one is worth watching past the first segment, Amateur Night, which is probably my favorite of the entire series, and I think the second movie actually has a better batting average. It's been a few years since I've seen it, but to my recollection, there weren't any bad segments in VHS 2, and the segments Safe Haven and Alien Abduction Sleepover Party or something like that, I don't really remember the title, really got to me. At the very least with these movies, you're bound to find something that interests you, and if you're not into a particular segment, then you can rest easy knowing it's not gonna last too much longer, and maybe the next one will be your thing. This fourth installment went straight to the horror streaming service Shudder, and that's where I watched it, and I think the best way to approach reviewing this is to just kind of briefly run down what to expect with each segment and what I thought of them. There's a segment that wraps around each of the individual short films, and whether you consider it a segment proper, I guess is up to you. It's never the strong suit of these movies, but this one was really rough. It's directed by Jennifer Reeder, who also made Knives and Skin in 2019, which was basically if Twin Peaks was the worst movie I'd ever seen. The segment follows a SWAT team doing a drug bust, but what they find there is a cult of people who watch all these weird VHS tapes, and really it's just a cipher to get us to watch the VHS tapes. The acting in this one was noticeably worse than all of the other segments combined. It actually starts off pretty promising, but it really suffers throughout the film as we keep jumping back to these really unlikable characters, and it is simultaneously both under-explained and over-explained by the end, and not even remotely scary. It was very bad, but at least the wraparound segment is the one that you tend to remember the least, and that the movie seems to care about the least. Next, the first actual VHS tape in the film is told as a news broadcast with a news reporter and her cameraman going into the sewers to cover the local legend of a rat man. What I loved most about this segment was its tone. It's clearly going for something very subtly comedic, but also kind of unsettling, and I think it pulls it off really well. It starts with a series of interviews with locals who claim to have seen the rat man, and it's a really entertaining way to poke fun at the kind of weird people that you might see interviewed on your local TV station. There are also some very creepy moments, and there's one shot that's really stuck with me and that deeply unsettled me. It gets a bit silly and maybe tries to bite off more than it can chew towards the end, but it's all kind of worth it because the last moments are genuinely hilarious and gross and a little disturbing, so yeah, I liked it. Next. The next segment follows someone who just started working at a funeral home, and she's hosting a wake for the first time, but nobody shows up for some reason. If you don't count the wraparound, this is probably my least favorite segment in the film. It's pretty obvious where it's going to go from the setup, and boy does it take its time getting there. The vast majority of this segment is very uneventful, and it's not building any tension because you know exactly what's gonna happen. With that said, the payoff, while unsurprising, is handled quite well with some really neat practical effects, and it almost made me forget how boring the rest of the segment was. Next. The third segment proper is by Indonesian director Timo Tjahjanto, who was one of two people who directed Safe Haven in VHS 2, which many consider to be the best segment in the franchise. His segment in this this film is a fairly typical story of a mad scientist doing gruesome experiments on people, or at least that's what you think it's gonna be before it goes off the rails completely into what is ostensibly a first-person shoot-'em-up type video game. Of all the segments in this film, this is the one that feels the most purposefully shot. It's very clear that the director didn't choose to show things or not show things randomly, but knew what would be most effective to show when. For me, the most effective part of this segment was the opening. It starts with a close-up shot, and then when we see the full picture, it is genuinely horrifying. The biggest drawback, though, is that it is way too long. At one point, I wrote a note saying that it should have ended by now, and that turned out to be only about halfway through. I'm sure this will be many people's favorite segment, especially if you really like video games. The extent of my gaming is occasionally Minecraft and Too Much Planet Coaster. So I did think it had a lot of fun moments, but it was overall too long. Next, thankfully, the final segment was my favorite. It follows a right-wing militia group who were planning a terrorist attack with some sort of secret weapon, and when it started, I was really worried that it would take itself too seriously and try to make an actual statement. To be clear, I don't think there is anything wrong with exploring serious and relevant topics through horror, and most of my favorite horror films do exactly that. It just would not have fit in this particular film, where the previous 3 segments were more about fun than anything. And to my delight, this segment very quickly reveals that it is not trying to be serious at all, and it was the most fun out of all of them. I don't want to spoil the secrets of this one because it is a blast to watch without knowing what's coming. It's over the top, it's entertaining, it's occasionally kind of scary, and it's so funny. And that rounds out the 4 main segments in VHS 94. I don't think any of these are as good as the best segments of the first and second movies, but I do think it is the most consistent. Each segment seems to be focusing on fun rather than genuinely trying to scare you, and that makes for a very entertaining watch. I cannot stress enough that this is a much trashier horror film than something like The Witch or Hereditary, so if you're planning on watching this, or at least checking out the segments that I would recommend, then do temper your expectations accordingly. 3 stars out of 5. And the final film I'm going to talk about today is Lamb. This is the first film from Icelandic director Valdimar Jóhannsson. It's being marketed as one of those like A24 horror movies that somehow become a genre in and of itself. With other films they've distributed and produced, such as The Witch, The Lighthouse, Midsommar, Hereditary, It Comes at Night, and the list goes on, they've certainly established a pattern of a specific type of horror film that's a slow burn that is more disturbing than it is scary. And these films have certainly found an audience. So the way A24 has chosen to market Lamb makes a lot of sense, but I think the marketing is pretty misleading. There are certainly 1 or 2 scenes that could be classified as horror, but on the whole, this is undoubtedly a slow burn drama. The film follows Maria and Ingvar, who are a married couple living on a sheep farm in rural Iceland, and one of their sheep inexplicably gives birth to a half-human, half-lamb baby. To be honest, I don't have a whole lot to say about this movie. It's good. There's not really any aspect of this movie that I would say is noticeably bad, but there's also not a single aspect of this movie that really blew me away. It's shot really well. There are a lot of beautifully framed images of the Icelandic landscape. There are really great central performances and well laid out subtleties to the characters' relationship. From the beginning, there is a clear sense of separation between the 2 main characters, but no outward conflict. It's through their body language and the way they talk about the past and the way they rarely appear in a frame together that communicates these ideas to the audience. Pretty early on, I felt I pinpointed an event in their past that hadn't been spoken about, and much later in the film this was confirmed without any clunky exposition or a cheesy flashback. The way information is revealed is probably my favorite aspect of this film. It's always very rewarding to be able to put the pieces together just from being observant and not being beaten over the head with it. This film really does respect its audience's intelligence. But what really holds the film back is kind of a 2-pronged issue. It's really repetitive. There are so many scenes in this that don't feel necessary at all. A slow-paced film only really works if it feels like every scene is progressing in some way, or that each scene allows us to understand a character's motivation and mental state in a deeper way. But I really didn't feel that that was the case in this film. The status quo just never really feels like it's changing. The characters are always in the same emotional state, and if they do change, it happens very quickly and without any sense of progression. And I think this is all a symptom of the fact that the movie doesn't feel like it should be as long as it is. The logical conclusion of this setup could have easily been reached about half an hour in, but the vast bulk of the middle portion of this film is a side plot that comes to a conclusion that doesn't feel very satisfying or like it added anything thematically. I think the director definitely had something that he wanted to convey metaphorically in this film, but I'm not sure it's well communicated to the audience. Every metaphorical reading I have of this film feels pretty half-baked, unfortunately. I think the theme that is most front and center is our relationship to the natural world and the fact that we are, at the end of the day, animals just like any other creature on this planet. And this is a topic that's very close to my heart and spiritual beliefs, but I didn't feel that this film made me think or feel any differently about these ideas than I already do. I think metaphorical stories like this really only work when they're truly saying something about the way the world is versus how it ought to be, or at the very least be able to communicate some emotion or idea that we all experience that's otherwise incommunicable. And there is a lot of that in this movie, but it's just too unfocused for me to feel that I got something truly concrete out of it. It sounds like I'm bashing on this movie more than the other ones in this video, but that's because this is the only one that I think really had the potential to be a great film. I don't think there was anything to take thematically from Venom Let There Be Carnage, nor did I think there was any intention to do so. And like I said, I do think that Lamb is a good film, especially for being the director's first film. I think he has a really good eye for visuals, and I'll definitely be following his career. And even if I didn't find it a thematically or emotionally coherent watch, the final shot really broke my heart and did work for me on an emotional level. The ending of this movie is a bit strange and a bit out of nowhere, but where it leaves the characters is quite impactful. So even though it's just shy of greatness and maybe doesn't make the most out of its premise, I still think this is a good film that you should go see. And Lamb is gonna get 3.5 stars from me. And that rounds out my weekend movies. I hope I was able to shed some light here on movies that you may not have heard of that are worth your time, and I hope to continue to do so into the future. See you next week.